there everyone, hope you're all doing well. I've always said that since I've started my videos, and I think it started because of the virus, but now it just feels weird saying anything else because I do still hope you're doing well. It's freezing right now in the UK, which is why I'm wearing this. It's the comfiest thing I have ever owned in my life, and if any of you follow me on Instagram you'll probably see me in it every single day. I swear to God I'm washing it, I promise. You know, like when you were little and you put your favourite teddy in the wash and you just watched it in the machine, this is what I'm like with this. It's the best and I'm so cozy. That was intense. Anyway, I just really love this outfit, I'm sorry. I'll stop chatting your head off, let's get into the case. This case is about a boy called Daniel Bartland. Daniel was born on November the 11th in 1996 in Nottinghamshire in the UK. His mum was Jacky Bryant and his dad was Adrian Bartland, and they got married when he was 3 years old. Daniel grew up in a really nice house, he had a lovely life, he went to private school, he had a very nice upbringing. When Daniel was 9, his baby brother Dominic came along in 2005. But unfortunately, shortly after Dominic arrived, his mum and dad split up, it just wasn't working and they went their separate ways. Daniel seemed to take the split pretty well. He spent the weekends with his dad and he spent the rest of the time with his mum. As I said, Daniel did go to private school, but shortly after the divorce, his dad was the one that kind of paid for that side of things, and his mum was having to downsize, so they were going to be moving house. They were looking around for a smaller house for just her and the two boys to live in. Ooh. And with the move, she was also going to be moving Daniel into a public school, which Daniel wasn't too happy about. Everything Daniel knew was at the private school. He had friends there, he just preferred it, and he really didn't like the idea of going to public school. He was like, no, I need to stay in this school, I need to go to private school. So his mum, scraped all the money she could together and paid for him for another 6 months to go to private school, just until she physically couldn't do it anymore. A few years after the separation in 2008, Jacky was out on a night out and she met a man called Simon and they started going out. Neither of them were out looking for it, they just, bumped into each other, met, and they really hit it off. They were really happy together and it was going that well that they were actually planning for Simon to move in with them. And Jacky really wanted her boys to be okay with this and she was trying to involve them as much as possible, I think. So with this she would try and get the boys' approval for the houses, but Daniel wouldn't approve any of them. He was just trying to be really awkward and would just be like, no, I don't like that one, I don't like that one. And she listened to him. She would just be like, oh okay, we'll keep looking, and he wouldn't approve any of them because he didn't want to be taken out of his school and he didn't want to move, so that was kind of it. He just wouldn't approve any houses. With Jacky trying to include him, I think she felt really guilty about everything that had been going on, kind of realising the effect that separations can have on kids. But then with that, Daniel got way too much say than he should have. I'm not for 1 second blaming Jacky for any of this, I'm just saying I think that's how it came across to Daniel, that it was kind of, he got the last say because she was kind of letting him. Simon started noticing as well that when Jacky's back was turned, Daniel would start hitting his little brother or pinching him or just, giving him little digs. Dominic was much younger than Daniel. It wasn't like there was a year gap and, he could kind of take him on. Because siblings fight, it's just, I think Dominic was about 3. And Daniel was trying to beat him up at 9. So just, yeah, really, really strange. And maybe that was a sign of jealousy from Daniel. Maybe he was pinching Dominic because he wasn't getting any attention anymore, maybe trying to get a bit of a rise out of his mum. And I saw a psychologist talking about this situation who said that Daniel possibly was being scared by the lack of control he had over the split up, the move, him moving school, even Dominic coming along. He felt like things were happening to him, not around him. So Daniel became a pretty unhappy child. He'd lock himself away for hours and hours in his room. He'd have his meals up there. He would watch telly there. There was no contact between him and the rest of the family really. He just became like older teenagers do. I definitely went and sat in my room, for hours on end when I was about 16, but he was a lot younger. So Daniel became a bit of a loner. He didn't really have any friends, he didn't have a social life. He literally just sat in his room constantly, wouldn't really speak to anyone, wouldn't do anything, didn't help around the house, didn't do anything. And Jacky just hoped that this was a phase that Daniel was going through and he'd kind of snap out of it soon. And Daniel seemed to blame his mum for the life that he was having. And because he saw his dad less, it's thought that maybe he was able to kind of make up that he was this good guy in the situation, even though they were both the same. Mum and dad, you know, decided together that they were going to split up, but all the blame went on Jacky. Daniel started watching tons and tons of horror films, and he'd watched them from about the age of 8, but he'd been watching films like Saw and, you know, torture films basically. And that's a really young age to be watching those things. I can't watch Saw. I can read about real things, but when it's that exaggerated and sad, I can't watch people suffer like that. I don't know how he would do that as an 8-year-old. I couldn't do that now. He'd watch torture films, horror films, things that were way too old for him, and he'd even put compilations together and make videos for YouTube about his favourite torture sections of films. Yeah. Like, when I was his age, I was making Buffy compilations to Evanescence songs for YouTube. And because he was exposed to violent imagery from so young, he started looking for bigger things. He was just looking constantly for more horrific things to watch, because it was just kind of like, oh, I've seen that one, you know, it doesn't really affect me anymore. And he just kept going down these holes of horrific videos, stories and images. And soon he started trying to make his own. He liked to make YouTube videos just talking to the camera, and they're relatively normal. It's just him vlogging basically. But then because he was watching these films and hearing these stories, he started writing his own stories as well and drawing his own pictures of really violent things. Simon says about a time when he was really proud. He brought down this story that he wrote about 2 kids walking home from school. They get into an argument and the one that's being picked on stabbed the other one. And he was really happy with this story, because I think to him it was just normal, like that's what he'd been watching. He was like, oh, okay, well, I'm gonna write something similar to that. And Simon and his mum were both just like, well, why would you write something like this? And they obviously didn't encourage him to carry on writing things like that. He'd also draw really gory pictures of things like people with blood all over them, people being stabbed. And I think this is a really hard thing to try and look into. I think if that's something that you're taking in every single day, especially Daniel being sat in his room, no one else to really speak to, I mean, probably from his own choice, but if he's just sat there alone, he's got all these images coming to him, he's got all these stories, he's going to start writing those himself if he wants to write, because that's all he knows. Does that make sense? As usual, not trying to justify anything he does. A lot of people say that things Daniel did were because of gory films and horror films, and loads of people look at horror films every single day. Lots of people look at even true crime cases every single day. I'm not going to go out and hurt anyone, but I do find this stuff really interesting. I don't really think it's fair to say if you take in that stuff, you're going to do that stuff. Someone who watches horror films, maybe if they want to be a writer, they watch a horror film, they come up with their own horror film, they write it down. It doesn't mean that they're gonna do it. But I don't think it's fair to directly blame just horror films on people behaving like that. It's got to be, horror films may contribute, but there's got to be something else that isn't quite right with you to be able to act on it and do something really horrific to someone. Simon found it really hard with Daniel to try and be able to know when to step in or when to leave it, because at the end of the day, Daniel wasn't his child. He wasn't even married to his mum, I don't think. He was just, you know, a mum's boyfriend. So it's a really hard situation to be in, because he can't exactly discipline, he's not his dad. But also you can't let a child take advantage of their mum. So Simon really tried to stay back and try and get Jacky to take responsibility for the things that Daniel did and, you know, leave her to discipline him. But it wasn't often that she did, by the sounds of it. There was one time that Simon says he did intervene, and that was because Daniel had decided he wanted to order a pizza after they'd all eaten, which is a bit of a nasty thing to do when his mum had just cooked him dinner. But anyway, he wanted a pizza and his mum said no, you've just eaten. So he went behind her back, ordered it anyway, and then when it came, he paid for it with his own money. It was one of them, his mum had said no, and Daniel was just trying to be like, well, I'm doing it by myself, like, what's the issue? But this sparked a massive argument to the point where Daniel was over Jacky with his fists clenched and was shouting right in her face. And Simon just said to him, you know, you better get out of here right now. You're not on. Ooh, I keep knocking this. Simon just said, you better get out of here. It's not on. He didn't threaten him, he said, but he just told him to get out. You know, was like, back off. You're not speaking to her like that. And then Daniel went up, basically had a tantrum, started knocking things, started hitting things, started hitting himself, and was just shouting, screaming, swearing for, you know, quite a few minutes until he calmed down. But he said that was one of the only times he actually stepped in and did something. So finally, with Daniel's approval, or without Daniel's approval, probably without, Jacky found a new house to move into. And Jacky and Simon were cleaning out Daniel's room. I'm not sure why he wasn't doing it himself, maybe it was a protest thing, but either way, they were cleaning out his room. And in his room, they found, this is gross, just a warning, they found tubs of urine and feces all over his room. He'd gone to the loo properly in all of his toy boxes, which were like expensive toys, like sci-fi things, you know, the figures that they just overcharge you for. He'd gone on all of them and wiped himself with towels and then hid the towels all over his room. And they said that they weren't new, it wasn't, I mean, not that that makes it any better, but they'd been there for a while. He'd just gone in his room, even though this kid had an ensuite in his room. Some of the psychologists who were looking at this case thought that maybe this was like an FU to his mum, being like, look what I've done to these expensive toys, like, this is how much I hate you, kind of thing. No one really knows why he did it, but obviously that isn't normal behaviour. And when Simon brought this up to Jacky, Jacky was just kind of like, oh, well, that's what kids do. It's definitely not what kids do. Obviously, I wasn't there, I don't know exactly what was said, but that is how Jacky's response has been told, that she was just like, that's what kids do. And it's just a really strange way to react to something like that. Like, Simon was really kind of freaked out by this. It got a different kind of worrying though when they actually found a laptop bag full of Jacky's underwear. And Jacky's his mum. Why would you do that? Why would you take your mum's underwear and keep them in your room? And again, Simon brought this up, was like, look what I found, and Jacky was just like, oh, I was wondering where they'd gone. And again, she was said to have just laughed the whole thing off. Simon said that there was an incident where Daniel and Simon both cleaned the pond together. They were trimming out all of the, you know, dead. Simon says there was an incident where him and Daniel were cleaning the pond together. Jacky had a brand new pond and they were trying to make it all nice for her. They were trimming back all the old plants, just making it nice and neat, and they were pretty much done. And then Simon said he had to go out and get something, and when he came back, all the flowers had been trimmed back, like every single one just been cut off. The whole thing was trashed, it had just all been ripped up and destroyed basically. Whole thing was just a mess. And obviously Daniel had done this when Simon was out, and when Simon was like, well, why would you do that? We had it perfect. Daniel just started crying and started saying, I was trying to help, and just got really upset over it. A lot of people say he was trying to test how people's emotions worked around him, and he knew that this would upset Simon, and that's why he did it, just to get a reaction. Obviously I'm not a professional at all whatsoever, but I think maybe it was more of a, I'm gonna make him shout at me and then I'll be able to tell my mum that Simon shouted at me for this. I think he was trying to manipulate the situation that way, but that is just my personal opinion. I think he was trying to cause trouble to make it look like a good deed and then be like, oh, I was trying to help and he shouted at me, that kind of thing. Another story that Simon had was that Jacky had rang him late at night one day and said that Daniel was missing from home, he'd run away. And he had done this before for attention, and there was a big search for him. They called the police were out looking for him, everyone was looking for him, and they found him at around 1 in the morning, walking, making his way back to the old house. And psychologists think that it's a possibility that Daniel fully knew how this would come across. He knew that his mum would look at this situation and be like, oh, Daniel's trying to get back to the old house because that's where he was happy and I feel so guilty for this, I just want to give him more things that he wants. They think that he might have been doing that. Now, remember all of those incidents that I've just told you about. I have a very less than professional theory on what he was doing with all those things. So just before I tell you that, Daniel, after he had watched, you know, all the horror films he could, he was done with those. He started looking for things that were maybe a bit more normal to his situation, and he started watching soaps with violent storylines, and his absolute favourite was Coronation Street, because soaps are very normal. They have normal storylines, it's believable, the things that happen, they're not too extreme, whereas horror films, you know, can just go a bit nuts. They're really overdone, the gore is excessive, whereas Coronation Street was achievable to him. Now again, not professional whatsoever. Now what I think he was doing with the leaving the presents in his room, running away from home, wrecking the pond and taking his mum's underwear, I think he was trying to set a scene. I think he was trying to make his life like a soap, like something that dramatic that I'd be like, oh, what's Daniel done? Oh my gosh, he's stolen his mum's underwear. And him wrecking the pond too. It's like, oh, I was trying to help, and everything's all so dramatic. I genuinely think he was trying to kind of reenact some storylines or similar storylines that he'd seen within the soaps he was watching or the films he was watching. Especially when I heard about the running away from home thing, going back to the old house. Now I don't know if maybe I just haven't seen that many films and this has happened a lot, but does anyone remember that scene in Cheaper by the Dozen where the, is it Mark, the FedEx kid that they all call FedEx? He does the same thing. He's like the least favourite kid. He gets on the train and tries to go back to the old house where everyone was all happy, and there's a big search for him and it's all very dramatic, and then they all tell him they love him. I think it was possibly inspired by that. Maybe that's just me and I've seen like no films and it's happened in like 10 that I don't know about, but that just instantly made me think of Cheaper by the Dozen. I think that maybe he wanted that kind of reaction from his mum. Just a thought. Again, not a professional, don't come for me. So as I said, Daniel absolutely loved Coronation Street, and one storyline in particular was his absolute favourite. John State killed someone with a hammer and then covered it up in a fire. And that massively inspired Daniel. He became obsessed with him and obsessed with the storyline, and even started writing his own soaps where Daniel was the star. He was saying how he was the longest running soap star, how he was a serial murderer and serial rapist, and he'd gotten away with all these crimes under the noses of everyone. Kids and even adults often have fantasies where they're like, oh, I wish I was famous, let's actually write this down, let's do this. But with Daniel, he took it one step further. In this script, he killed his mum, called Jacky. Now, his mum, Jacky, spelt her name with a Q-U-I, like Jackie. And what was that? And the Jacky in the script was Jackie. So he'd made that change for some reason, and he'd deleted this script off his computer. During this time as well, he was in school and he'd been sent to the school nurse because he was in class and he started shouting, saying that his tie was called Fred and he was going to hurt him and he was trying to kill him, and he was also saying that he was hearing voices a lot. Now, he was assessed for any kind of mental illness and it came back clear that he didn't have a mental illness. So obviously maybe this assessment was wrong, or maybe Daniel was just making things up to try and kind of grab at what he did and to find an excuse to go along with his plan. So around Easter 2011, Daniel was 14 and he was spending Easter with his mum and his brother. Simon was away for the weekend, but he had been speaking to Jacky here and there, just seeing how she was and what she was up to. But on Tuesday the 26th of April 2011, in the early hours of the morning, there was a massive house fire. The estate had been cordoned off and it was said that there were 2 little boys and a dog that had been found outside who'd escaped the fire, and their mum was still inside. Obviously this was Daniel, Dominic and the family dog. Jacky was still inside and had unfortunately died in the fire. Daniel was questioned straight away about what happened that night. Daniel had said that he got up in the night to go to the loo and then he saw a masked man in his house, and the masked man had attacked his mum and started a fire in the house. So Daniel saw this, threw a hammer at the man and then got his little brother, got the dog and left the house. Obviously this was a pretty unbelievable story that not many people were buying. Detectives were able to go into the house and find the room where the fire was started, and from the room they were able to find where the fire was started within that room, and it was found that it was started on or right around Jacky's body. And even though this murder was fully premeditated, he'd written scripts on this and everything, he hadn't thought of the aftermath at all. He thought that, like the person on Coronation Street and like all the people he idolised that were getting away with this kind of thing, he would too, and it just wasn't the case. They were able to find out exactly what had happened on that night. Daniel and Jackie had argued earlier that day and Jackie had gone to bed. But then at 1 in the morning, Daniel burst into her room and started screaming at her. I'm not sure of the exact argument, but it had something to do with new trainers that he couldn't find. So he just came into his mum's room and started screaming at her. They got into a massive argument, and then Daniel pulled a hammer out and hit his mum multiple times across the head with it. He fractured his skull and her face. And then, trying to make himself out to be the hero, grabbed his little brother, grabbed the dog, and went and stood outside and watched the fire with the neighbours as if he'd just escaped this whole thing. Daniel's computer was seized and all the scripts he'd written were easily found. Even though he thought he'd deleted it, obviously everything can be traced and everything can be recovered, and they found his plan basically just written on there in the form of a script. He'd also been googling things like how to get away with murder and looking up people who got away with murder too. And just 2 days after the fire, Daniel was arrested on suspicion of murdering his mum. On October the 4th, 2011, Daniel pleaded not guilty, and he said that he'd been provoked in this whole attack. And they needed to prove that Daniel had actually meant to kill his mum, otherwise he would just walk free from this. On January the 23rd, 2012, his trial started, and he was described as being really arrogant through the whole trial. He wasn't really remorseful, he wasn't crying. He was putting his head in his hands constantly, but not in a "oh, I'm so upset" way. He was like putting his head in his hands and then looking around to see who was watching him. And apparently Daniel genuinely believed that he was going to get out of this, he was going to just get away with it. But there was so much evidence from his computer that showed that he had intended to kill his mum. After 2 weeks, the jury came back with a verdict. On the 2nd of April 2012, Daniel was sentenced to life in prison with a minimum of 16 years. He was found guilty of the murder of his mum, Jackie. Daniel's eligible for release in 2028, so that means he could be out by the time he's 30. It's still really puzzling to people why he did this. Like, a lot of people don't get on with their parents, but not many people do what Daniel did. And it's clear to me from everything I've read that Jackie just wanted the best life for Daniel. She really, I don't know, she spoiled him basically, like, from the sounds of it. She, you know, he was her baby. She just really wanted to make sure he had a nice life, and she did feel guilty because of the separation, and it was just thrown back at her. Professionals have said as well that in basic terms it didn't help that Daniel wasn't challenged for the way that he behaved. So there's a few documentaries that fully like blame Jackie in a way for what happened, which is just horrific. Obviously no one's going to know, not even Simon is going to know properly the dynamic of everything on the whole within that family. It's really sad that he did that to her when she was just trying to do the best she could for him. And yeah, maybe she was very soft with him, but I just think that Jackie felt so guilty for everything that had happened with the separation, and she was just trying to get Daniel to like her basically and respect her, and it just never worked. I think even if that did contribute to the murder, like the horror films might have contributed, the not being confronted about his actions and gradually getting worse contributed. I don't think, again, that was it. Like, there has to have been something not quite right with Daniel for him to do that. Anyway, that's it for this one. It really made me sad. I don't really know what to think about this case. It's just really, really strange. Thank you so much for watching. As always, please follow me on Twitter and Instagram because I'll always be posting things on there about my videos, and it's nice to just be able to chat on other places, not just on YouTube. I upload a new true crime video every single Sunday, and I'm going to be looking into other little things as well to put on my channel through the week, which I'm really excited about. So please like and subscribe. As I've said before, it really, really helps me. It lets YouTube know that you like my videos and it suggests them to other people, which is what we want. So thank you again so much, and I will see you in my next one.